Before the world knew sunlight, before mountains rose from primordial seas, before the first breath of mortal life disturbed the cosmic silence, there existed only chaos. From this formless void emerged forces so ancient that even the gods themselves would one day bow to their authority. Among these primordial powers, two beings shaped the very foundation of what would become the realm of the dead. Erebus, the embodiment of darkness itself, and Nyx, the goddess of night, joined together to create the essential framework through which all mortality would eventually pass. Erebus represented not merely the absence of light, but darkness as a tangible force, a substance that could be felt and measured. Ancient Greek cosmology understood darkness not as emptiness but as a fundamental element of existence, as real and necessary as earth or water. This primordial darkness filled the spaces between worlds, provided the canvas upon which reality itself was painted, and established the essential nature of the realm that would house the dead. Without Erebus, there could be no boundary between the world of the living and the domain of eternal rest. Nyx arrived with equal cosmic significance, bringing with her the concept of night as a force that governed time itself. Her domain extended beyond simple darkness to encompass the cyclical nature of existence, the rhythm of sleep and waking, the pattern of life giving way to death and potentially to rebirth. Ancient sources describe her as one of the few beings whom even Zeus treated with cautious respect, recognizing that her power predated his own and operated according to principles that no Olympian authority could alter or challenge. From the union of Erebus and Nyx came the fundamental forces that would define mortality and its aftermath. Their offspring included Thanatos, the personification of death itself, and Hypnos, the embodiment of sleep. These twin brothers represented two aspects of the same cosmic function: the temporary unconsciousness of sleep and the permanent transition of death. The Greeks understood these states as intimately connected, viewing sleep as a small death and death as an eternal sleep. A philosophical framework that would influence Western thought for millennia. Thanatos manifested as a young man of stern but not cruel countenance, bearing black wings that allowed him to move between the worlds of the living and the dead with perfect ease. Unlike later personifications of death as a skeletal reaper, the Greek Thanatos possessed beauty and dignity, reflecting the culture's understanding that death was not an enemy to be feared but a natural conclusion to be accepted. He carried a sword, though his touch alone was sufficient to separate soul from body, and his presence brought not terror but gentle release from the burdens of mortal existence. His twin, Hypnos, shared his brother's winged form but manifested with softer features and a more approachable demeanor. Sleep required cooperation rather than conquest, persuasion rather than force. Ancient artists depicted Hypnos bearing poppies, flowers associated with both sleep and forgetfulness, and a horn containing waters from the River Lethe, which granted oblivion to those who drank. His realm bordered that of his brother, and mortals passed through the territory of sleep each night, unknowingly practicing for their eventual journey into death's permanent embrace. The cosmological structure of the ancient Greek universe divided existence into distinct realms, each occupying its own space in a carefully ordered hierarchy. At the apex existed the bright realm of Olympus, home to the younger gods who had overthrown the Titans, blazing with eternal light and perfumed with ambrosia. Below the heavens stretched the middle realm of Earth, the dwelling place of humanity and the stage upon which the dramas of mortal life unfolded. This was the realm of change and transformation, where nothing remained permanent except the certainty of eventual transition to the realm below. Beneath the foundations of the earth itself lay the underworld, the realm of shadows where the dead would eventually gather. This subterranean domain existed not merely as a physical location but as a separate dimension of reality, occupying a space that defied normal geometric understanding. One entered the underworld by descending through specific cave systems, crossing certain bodies of water, or simply by dying and allowing one's soul to be conducted by Thanatos or Hermes to its appointed destination. The geography of the underworld developed gradually as the Olympian gods established their rule and divided the cosmos among themselves. When Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades drew lots to determine their respective domains following their victory over the Titans, Hades received sovereignty over the realm of the dead and all the subterranean regions that lay beneath the earth's surface. This domain included not only the shadowy plains where souls would dwell, but also the vast networks of caves, the underground rivers that connected different regions, and even the precious metals and gems that lay hidden in deep veins of ore. The entrance to the underworld proper required passage across the River Styx, the most famous and significant of the 5 great rivers that define the realm's geography. The Styx flowed in a great circle around the entire underworld, creating a boundary that separated the living world from the domain of the dead. Its dark waters possessed supernatural properties that made them lethal to living beings while providing a highway for the dead. The river's name derived from the nymph Styx, daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, who had sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy and earned the honor of having her name attached to the most sacred oath that gods could swear. Ancient sources consistently emphasized the binding nature of oaths sworn by the Styx. When gods invoked this river's name while making a promise, they subjected themselves to terrible consequences should they prove false. Zeus himself established this protocol, decreeing that any deity who swore falsely by the Styx would lose their voice for 9 years, be excluded from divine assemblies, and be deprived of nectar and ambrosia. This punishment was severe enough to ensure that gods considered their words carefully before invoking the Styx, creating a form of cosmic contract law that even divine beings dared not violate. The physical characteristics of the Styx reflected its mythological significance. The waters appeared black as obsidian, yet possessed a mirror-like surface that revealed not mere reflections but deeper truths about those who gazed into its depths. The current moved with supernatural force, capable of sweeping away anything that entered without proper authorization from underworld authorities. Temperature fluctuations ranged from freezing to scalding within the same stretch of river, creating conditions that would prove immediately fatal to any living creature attempting unauthorized crossing. The ferryman Charon maintained exclusive control over legitimate passage across the Styx. This ancient figure predated even the Olympians, having served the realm of the dead since time immemorial. His appearance reflected his great age and his grim function. Ancient descriptions portrayed Charon as an elderly man with unkempt white beard, deep-set eyes that burned with dim fire, and clothing that consisted of dark, tattered robes stained by centuries of service. Despite his shabby appearance, Charon wielded absolute authority over his domain, refusing passage to those who lacked proper payment or authorization, regardless of their status in life or death. The payment system Charon enforced created important cultural practices surrounding death and burial in ancient Greece. Families placed coins, typically an obol or dannik, in the mouths or on the eyes of the deceased during funeral preparations. This coin served as payment for Charon's services, ensuring that the soul could cross the Styx and proceed to judgment rather than being forced to wander the riverbank for 100 years before receiving charity passage. The practice became so ingrained in Greek culture that even the poorest families found ways to provide this essential payment, recognizing that failure to do so would consign their loved one to a century of limbo existence. Charon's boat itself was a marvel of supernatural engineering, constructed from materials that existed nowhere in the mortal world and possessing properties that allowed it to navigate the Styx's treacherous waters regardless of the number or nature of its passengers. The vessel could expand or contract according to need, accommodating anywhere from a single soul to hundreds of recent dead, all while maintaining perfect balance and stability despite the river's violent currents. The boat's hull had been treated with substances that rendered it immune to the Styx's corrosive properties, ensuring its eternal serviceability. The crossing itself required variable time depending on the soul's circumstances and the ferryman's assessment of their nature. Some souls completed the journey in moments, while others found themselves subjected to extended passage during which Charon might share fragments of wisdom about the realm they were entering or warnings about the judgment they would soon face. The ferryman's knowledge of underworld operations was encyclopedic, accumulated over countless millennia of service, making him a valuable source of information for those rare living heroes who managed to enter the realm of the dead while still breathing. Beyond the Styx lay the remaining 4 rivers that shaped the underworld's geography and defined its various regions through their unique properties and courses. The river Acheron, whose name meant River of Woe, carried the concentrated sorrow of every mortal who had ever lived. Its waters flowed with a gentle current through the central regions of the underworld, providing transportation between different administrative centers and judgment facilities. The sound of its flowing waters resembled countless voices weeping softly, a perpetual lamentation that filled the air with melancholy, but also with a strange sense of shared experience and universal suffering. The banks of the Acheron were lined with weeping willows whose branches drooped into the water, absorbing some of the emotional intensity while providing shaded rest areas for souls making their way through the underworld. These trees possessed their own form of consciousness, having absorbed so much sorrow over the ages that they had developed sensitivity to the emotional states of passing souls. Some ancient sources suggested that the willows could even communicate after a fashion, swaying their branches in patterns that conveyed warnings or encouragement to those who paid attention. The river Cocytus presented a dramatically different environment, flowing through the coldest regions of the underworld with waters that remained perpetually frozen at their surface, while the current beneath continued its inexorable flow. The river's name, meaning River of Lamentation, reflected its function as a place where souls who required extended periods of grief and reflection were housed. The banks of the Cocytus featured countless alcoves and chambers carved into ice, each providing a private space where individual souls could process their emotions and come to terms with their transition from life to death. The temperature along the Cocytus remained cold enough to preserve everything in a state of suspended animation. Yet the souls who dwelt there felt no physical discomfort from the chill. Instead, the cold served a psychological function, creating an atmosphere conducive to introspection and emotional processing. The river's constant sound, a mixture of flowing water and distant cries, provided a backdrop that somehow facilitated rather than impeded the grief work that souls needed to complete before moving on to their final destinations. The 4th river, Phlegethon, blazed with supernatural fire as it carved its channel through the most arid and volcanic regions of the underworld. Its name meant River of Fire, and its waters consisted entirely of flames that burned with such intensity that they could be seen from vast distances, providing illumination to regions that would otherwise remain in perpetual darkness. The Phlegethon's heat was not merely physical but carried purifying properties that could burn away spiritual contamination while leaving the essential soul intact and capable of regeneration. The banks of the Phlegethon consisted of volcanic glass and pumice stone, shaped by millennia of exposure to supernatural heat into formations that resembled frozen waves or tortured faces caught in eternal screams. These formations served both functional and symbolic purposes, providing surfaces that could withstand the river's temperature while reminding souls of the consequences of serious moral failure during life. The Phlegethon flowed primarily through Tartarus and other regions designated for punishment, though smaller tributaries extended into areas where purification rather than penalty was the primary objective. The fifth and perhaps most philosophically significant river was the Lethe, whose name meant River of Forgetfulness. This waterway wound through peaceful meadows where the temperature remained comfortable and the landscape showed none of the dramatic features that characterized other underworld regions. The Lethe's waters appeared crystal clear, sparkling with an inner light that suggested purity and renewal rather than danger or punishment. Yet these innocent-looking waters possessed the power to completely erase memory, removing all recollection of mortal existence from souls who drank from them. The Lethe served multiple functions within the underworld's operations, offering both blessing and curse depending on circumstances. Souls who had suffered traumatic deaths or carried unbearable guilt from their mortal lives could petition for access to the Lethe's waters, seeking the relief that complete forgetfulness could provide. Other souls approached the river as part of preparation for reincarnation, according to philosophical traditions that believed in cyclical existence. By drinking from the Lethe, these souls could return to mortal life without carrying baggage from previous existences, starting fresh with each new incarnation. Access to the Lethe was carefully controlled by underworld authorities who recognized the irreversible nature of memory loss and the need to ensure that souls made informed decisions about whether to drink. Counseling chambers lined the river's banks, staffed by experienced souls who had adapted successfully to afterlife existence and could provide guidance about whether the Lethe's forgetfulness would serve each individual's best interests. Some souls required complete memory erasure to function in their eternal existence, while others needed to retain their memories as part of their ongoing development or punishment. The interconnected network of these 5 rivers created a comprehensive transportation and organizational system that allowed efficient movement of souls throughout the underworld's vast territories. Canals and smaller waterways connected the major rivers, enabling souls to travel between different regions according to their needs or assignments. These connections were carefully engineered to prevent contamination between different types of water, while facilitating necessary communication and coordination between various administrative centers scattered throughout the realm. The physical landscape beyond the rivers varied dramatically according to region and function, creating environments suited to different types of souls and different aspects of underworld operations. The Asphodel meadows occupied the largest portion of the underworld's territory, designed to accommodate the majority of human souls who had lived ordinary lives without exceptional virtue or notable wickedness. This vast region featured endless fields covered with asphodel flowers, plants that symbolized the connection between life and death while providing a neutral, neither particularly pleasant nor unpleasant environment. The asphodel flowers themselves possessed unique characteristics that made them ideal for this neutral realm. These lily-like plants produced pale blooms that never fully opened nor completely withered, maintaining a state of eternal potential that mirrored the suspended existence of the souls who dwelt among them. The flowers' roots drew sustenance from the underworld's soil, which contained mineral compositions found nowhere else in the cosmos, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem that required no maintenance or cultivation yet never flourished into abundant life. The architecture within the Asphodel meadows emphasized functionality and basic dignity rather than luxury or punishment. Simple but well-constructed dwellings dotted the landscape, providing privacy and shelter for individual souls or small groups who found companionship in shared afterlife existence. These structures were built from materials quarried within the underworld itself, stones that possessed the interesting property of being both solid and slightly translucent, allowing some light to filter through walls while maintaining structural integrity sufficient to withstand the passage of unlimited time. Public spaces within the Asphodel meadows served important social and administrative functions that helped souls adapt to their eternal existence. Forums provided gathering places where souls could engage in discussion, share experiences from their mortal lives, and form relationships that made infinity more bearable. Libraries housed records not only of individual life stories but also of historical events, philosophical texts, and literary works that had been created throughout human civilization. These repositories allowed souls to continue learning and growing despite their separation from mortal existence, providing intellectual stimulation that prevented the stagnation that might otherwise result from endless, unchanging existence. The administrative infrastructure required to manage the constant influx of new souls while maintaining order among existing residents represented a significant organizational achievement. Processing centers near the region's borders handled initial orientation for newly arrived souls, providing them with information about their new existence, explaining the resources available to them, and helping them locate appropriate housing and activities. These facilities were staffed by experienced souls who had adapted successfully to afterlife existence and could provide guidance and reassurance to newcomers struggling with the transition from life to death. The population of the Asphodel Meadows included the vast majority of human souls, those whose moral records contained neither exceptional virtue nor serious criminality. These ordinary individuals had lived decent if unremarkable lives, treating others with basic respect, fulfilling their obligations to family and community, and avoiding the extremes of behavior that would warrant either reward or punishment in the afterlife. Their eternal existence consisted of peaceful but somewhat melancholy activities, pursuing hobbies and interests they had enjoyed during life, forming friendships with other souls of similar temperament, and gradually coming to terms with their new reality. The emotional atmosphere of the Asphodel Meadows reflected this neutrality, creating an environment that was neither joyful nor tormented but rather pervaded by a quiet acceptance of fate. Souls residing there experienced neither the ecstatic happiness promised to inhabitants of Elysium nor the suffering inflicted on those condemned to Tartarus. They existed in a state that might be described as contentment without excitement, security without inspiration, an eternal middle ground that accurately reflected the moral mediocrity that had characterized their mortal lives. Elysium represented the opposite extreme, a paradise reserved for heroes, exceptionally virtuous individuals, and those who had earned divine favor through their mortal actions. This blessed realm occupied a separate region of the underworld, sometimes described as existing at its western extremity or even as inhabiting a separate dimension that merely connected to the larger underworld through specific passages. The geography of Elysium bore no resemblance to the shadowy plains and neutral meadows that characterized other underworld regions, instead presenting landscapes of extraordinary beauty that rivaled or exceeded anything found in the mortal world. The climate of Elysium remained perpetually mild, with gentle breezes carrying the scent of flowers that never faded and temperatures that required neither heavy clothing nor protective shelter. The sun shone continuously, yet its light never became harsh or uncomfortable, filtered through some supernatural mechanism that provided perfect illumination without the oppressive heat that might make eternal sunshine burdensome. Ancient sources sometimes suggested that Elysium existed in a separate temporal framework from the rest of the underworld, experiencing an endless golden afternoon that never progressed to evening or night. The landscape combined the most beautiful features of terrestrial geography with enhancements that only divine power could create. Rolling hills covered with soft grass provided perfect venues for athletics and recreation, their slopes never too steep for easy climbing yet substantial enough to provide variety and interest. Groves of fruit trees offered shade and sustenance, their branches perpetually heavy with produce of indescribable sweetness and perfection. Rivers of nectar and ambrosia flowed through the land, providing divine sustenance that maintained blessed souls in perfect health and eternal vigor. The architectural achievements of Elysium demonstrated the unlimited resources available for rewarding exceptional virtue. Palaces and temples constructed from materials that generated their own soft radiance housed the most distinguished heroes and demigods, providing them with luxurious accommodations that reflected their exalted status. These buildings featured colonnades of crystal and marble, floors of precious stones arranged in intricate mosaics, and roofs of gold that needed no structural support but floated through divine power above the spaces they sheltered. The overall effect created environments of surpassing beauty that nonetheless avoided ostentation or vulgarity, maintaining the dignity appropriate to eternal reward. The social organization of Elysium allowed blessed souls to interact with the greatest heroes and most virtuous individuals from throughout history, creating communities of exceptional people who could share their experiences and continue their development despite their departure from mortal existence. These interactions occurred naturally through shared activities rather than being forced by administrative decree. Heroes gathered for athletic competitions that tested skill without risking injury. Scholars engaged in philosophical discussions that explored questions left unresolved during their lifetimes, and artists pursued creative endeavors with unlimited resources and divine inspiration. The recreational facilities available in Elysium provided opportunities for every form of enjoyment that blessed souls might desire. Athletic stadiums allowed competitions in running, wrestling, boxing, and other sports beloved by ancient Greeks, with contests occurring according to regular schedules that helped structure eternal existence without becoming monotonous. These competitions operated without the stakes or consequences that attended mortal athletics, emphasizing excellence and the joy of participation rather than victory or defeat. Heroes could demonstrate their abilities without fear of injury or humiliation, competing against equals who shared their passion for physical achievement. Cultural venues included theaters where performances occurred continuously, featuring both historical works from mortal civilizations and new compositions created by blessed souls who possessed artistic gifts. These theatrical presentations ranged from tragic dramas exploring profound questions about fate and morality to comedies that provided lighthearted entertainment and relief from more serious pursuits. The performers and audiences alike found satisfaction in these cultural activities that connected them to the civilizations they had once inhabited, while allowing for continued artistic development and appreciation. Libraries in Elysium contained not only every text that had survived from mortal civilizations but also works that had been lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect in the world of the living. Scholars who had devoted their mortal lives to learning found themselves in paradise indeed, with access to unlimited knowledge and the time to absorb it all without the pressure of limited lifespan or competing obligations. These repositories also housed records of historical events as they actually occurred, free from the distortions and propaganda that often characterize mortal historical accounts, allowing blessed souls to finally learn the truth about events that had shaped their civilizations. The criteria for admission to Elysium remained somewhat flexible, reflecting ancient Greek understanding that exceptional virtue took many forms and that rigid categories might exclude worthy individuals due to technicalities. Heroes who had performed great deeds of courage and strength earned their place through actions that benefited their communities and demonstrated qualities that the Greeks valued highly. Philosophers and artists who had enriched human civilization through their intellectual or creative contributions found themselves welcomed despite never having wielded a sword or led armies. Even ordinary individuals who had lived with exceptional integrity and kindness might receive invitations to this blessed realm through divine recognition of their moral excellence. The presence of the Elysian fields within the broader underworld created aspirational goals that influenced mortal behavior, encouraging people to pursue virtue and excellence in hopes of earning eternal happiness after death. This motivational function served important social purposes in ancient Greek civilization, providing religious reinforcement for ethical behavior while offering comfort to those who faced hardship or injustice during their mortal lives. The promise that virtue would be rewarded eternally helped individuals endure temporary suffering while maintaining their moral standards despite temptations to compromise their principles for immediate gain. At the opposite end of the moral spectrum lay Tartarus, the deepest and most terrible region of the underworld, serving as both prison for divine criminals and punishment facility for souls who had committed serious moral offenses during their mortal lives. The geography of Tartarus reflected its punitive function through landscapes designed to facilitate various forms of corrective treatment, while maintaining absolute security against escape attempts. Ancient sources describe Tartarus as being as far below the normal underworld as heaven was above the earth, a distance that would take a bronze anvil 9 days to fall, emphasizing the extreme depth and isolation of this ultimate prison. The approach to Tartarus required descent through increasingly forbidding terrain as one traveled deeper into the foundations of the cosmos. The landscape transitioned from the neutral meadows of Asphodel through regions of increasing darkness and oppression, with air that grew heavier and more difficult to breathe, though souls no longer required respiration in the physical sense. The temperature fluctuated between extremes of heat and cold, creating discomfort that served as warning about the more serious sufferings that awaited within Tartarus proper. The walls surrounding Tartarus consisted of adamantine, a mythical substance harder than diamond and capable of containing even the most powerful divine beings. These fortifications rose to impossible heights, their surfaces smooth as glass and offering no possibility of climbing or escape. Bronze gates punctuated the walls at intervals, each sealed with divine locks that could only be opened through specific authorization from Hades or his appointed administrators. The gates themselves bore inscriptions in ancient languages describing the crimes that had earned various prisoners their eternal confinement. The Centimanes, the 300-handed giants named Briareus, Cottus, and Guys, served as guards over Tartarus, their multiple heads allowing them to monitor every corner of the vast prison simultaneously, while their numerous arms wielded weapons capable of subduing even the most powerful inmates. These primordial beings had themselves been imprisoned in Tartarus during the reign of the Titans, only to be freed by Zeus during the Titanomachy and subsequently appointed as guards over their former prison. Their loyalty to Zeus and the Olympian order remained absolute, motivated by gratitude for their liberation and recognition that their current position offered far better circumstances than their previous confinement. Within Tartarus, different regions were designated for different categories of prisoners and varying levels of punishment. The deepest levels housed the Titans who had opposed Zeus during the war for cosmic supremacy, including Cronus himself, the former ruler of the universe who had devoured his own children in a futile attempt to prevent prophecy from being fulfilled. These divine prisoners remained bound in adamantine chains, their power neutralized by restraints that even immortal strength could not break, their eternal imprisonment serving as both punishment for their rebellion and insurance against future attempts to overthrow Olympian rule. Other regions of Tartarus accommodated mortal souls whose crimes during life had been so severe that they warranted eternal punishment rather than temporary correction or neutral existence. Tantalus, the king who had served his own son as food to the gods in a grotesque test of their omniscience, stood forever in a pool of water that receded whenever he bent to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches lifted away whenever he reached for their produce. The punishment's genius lay in its psychological dimension, offering apparent relief that remained forever just beyond reach, creating a cycle of hope and disappointment that reinforced the torment continuously. Sisyphus, who had earned his punishment through multiple offenses including deceiving the gods and attempting to cheat death itself, was condemned to push a massive boulder up a steep hill for eternity. Each time he neared the summit, the stone would slip from his grasp and roll back to the bottom, forcing him to begin the process anew. The boulder's weight was carefully calibrated to match his strength, ensuring that the task remained perpetually difficult yet never quite impossible, maintaining the illusion of potential success that made the repeated failures psychologically devastating. Ixion's punishment for attempting to assault Hera addressed both his crime and his arrogance through particularly ingenious means. He was bound to a wheel of fire that rotated continuously through the air, carrying him in endless circles while flames consumed his body without providing the release of death or unconsciousness. Serpents served as the binding material, wrapping around his limbs and periodically injecting venom that caused additional agony without affecting the fundamental stability of his restraints. The wheel's rotation varied unpredictably between rapid spinning that created crushing force and slow movement that allowed full consciousness of his torment. The Danaides presented a case of collective punishment for collective crime, as 49 daughters of Danaus who had murdered their husbands on their wedding night were condemned to spend eternity attempting to fill a large vessel with water carried in jars that contained holes. The water leaked out as quickly as it could be poured in, creating an impossible task that symbolized both the violation of marriage bonds and the spilling of innocent blood. The punishment required continuous effort without hope of completion, much as their crime had destroyed potential futures and relationships before they could develop naturally. These famous punishments, while exceptional in their creativity and severity, represented only a fraction of the corrective measures employed throughout Tartarus. The vast majority of souls condemned to this region received treatments designed to address their specific moral failures while working toward eventual rehabilitation and possible transfer to less severe environments. The underworld's administrative philosophy recognized that most crimes resulted from combinations of circumstances, character flaws, and poor decisions rather than pure evil, suggesting that appropriate punishment combined with education and reflection might produce genuine moral improvement over time. The graduated punishment systems throughout Tartarus utilized the supernatural properties of the Phlegethon's flames to provide precisely calibrated levels of corrective treatment. Souls whose crimes had been serious but not irredeemable underwent periods of purification through controlled exposure to the river's fire, experiencing suffering sufficient to impress upon them the gravity of their offenses while avoiding the permanent psychological damage that excessive torture might inflict. These rehabilitation programs included educational components that helped souls understand the consequences of their actions and develop the moral reasoning they had lacked during life. The administrative infrastructure required to manage Tartarus's operations included extensive record-keeping systems that tracked each soul's progress through their assigned punishment. Experienced personnel monitored behavioral changes, assessed whether corrective measures were producing desired effects, and made recommendations about when souls might be ready for transfer to less severe conditions or even eventual release to neutral regions like the Asphodel meadows. This systematic approach reflected sophisticated understanding of justice as involving both punishment and rehabilitation rather than mere retribution. The Palace of Hades and Persephone served as the administrative and ceremonial center of the entire underworld, reflecting their dual authority as rulers of the realm of the dead. The palace's location at the symbolic heart of the underworld provided convenient access to all major regions, while maintaining appropriate distance from both the punishment facilities of Tartarus and the paradise of Elysium. The structure's architecture combined imposing grandeur with functional efficiency, creating spaces suitable for both formal ceremonies and the routine administrative work required to govern millions of souls. The exterior of the palace featured walls constructed from black marble that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a structure that appeared to exist as a void in visible space rather than a solid building. The marble surface had been polished to mirror smoothness, however, creating a paradoxical effect where the walls simultaneously absorbed and reflected light in ways that defied normal visual perception. Columns of obsidian supported a roof adorned with precious metals and gems arranged in patterns representing the constellations visible from the underworld, which differed from those seen in the mortal world due to the realm's unique position in cosmic geography. The main entrance was guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed hound whose presence served multiple functions including security, symbolism, and practical crowd control for souls attempting to enter or leave the palace grounds. This massive creature possessed supernatural senses that could distinguish between authorized visitors and those attempting unauthorized access, between living beings who had entered the underworld with divine permission and those who had died and belonged there permanently. Each of Cerberus's heads operated independently, allowing the Guardian to monitor multiple approach vectors simultaneously while maintaining conversation with individuals seeking legitimate entrance. The interior spaces reflected the dual nature of the palace's functions, combining private residential areas suitable for divine royalty with public spaces designed for administration, ceremony, and judgment. The throne room featured Hades's seat carved from obsidian and adorned with symbols of his dominion over both the dead and the earth's mineral wealth, while Persephone's throne incorporated materials that changed with the seasons, reflecting her dual nature as both queen of the underworld and goddess of spring. The positioning of the thrones side by side rather than hierarchically demonstrated their equal authority within the realm, a partnership arrangement unusual in patriarchal Greek society, but necessary given Persephone's unique status and divine power. Administrative offices throughout the palace housed the vast bureaucracy required to manage the underworld's complex operations. Scribes maintained detailed records of every soul's arrival, judgment, and placement within the appropriate region. Messengers carried communications between different facilities and departments, coordinating activities that required cooperation across the vast distances that separated various underworld locations. Counselors provided psychological support for souls struggling with their transition from life to death, while specialists addressed technical problems ranging from river maintenance to infrastructure repairs required by the passage of infinite time. The judicial system operated from dedicated courthouse facilities attached to the main palace complex, where the 3 judges appointed by Hades conducted their evaluations of newly arrived souls. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus each maintained separate courtrooms designed to accommodate their different approaches to moral evaluation while ensuring fair treatment for all souls regardless of their cultural backgrounds or historical periods. The judges' appointments reflected careful selection based on their reputations during mortal life for wisdom, fairness, and the ability to make difficult decisions in accordance with principles of justice rather than personal preference. Minos, as chief judge, handled the most complex cases requiring nuanced evaluation of circumstances and motivations. His courtroom featured a circular design that positioned him at the center while allowing all parties to observe proceedings from equal vantage points, symbolizing his commitment to impartial justice that considered all perspectives before rendering judgment. The walls bore elaborate murals depicting scenes of moral choices and their consequences, serving both as decoration and as educational tools that illustrated the principles guiding judicial decisions. Rhadamanthus specialized in cases from eastern regions and those requiring swift, decisive action when moral issues were clear-cut and circumstances allowed no ambiguity. His courtroom adopted a more traditional rectangular layout with his bench positioned to convey authority and finality, reflecting his reputation for unwavering application of established principles. The space emphasized efficiency and clarity, with minimal decoration that might distract from the serious business of evaluating souls and assigning appropriate afterlife placements. Aeacus served as judge for souls from northern regions while also functioning as arbiter in disputes between his fellow judges when they reached different conclusions about appropriate treatment for specific cases. His courtroom incorporated features that facilitated mediation and collaborative decision-making, with comfortable seating arranged to encourage dialogue and consensus building. This space also handled administrative appeals from souls who believed their initial judgments had been unfair or based on incomplete information, providing a safety valve that maintained faith in the system's fundamental fairness. The judgment process itself combined supernatural perception with careful evaluation of documentary evidence compiled during each soul's mortal life. The judges possessed the ability to perceive the complete moral history of souls brought before them, seeing not only their actions but also their motivations, the circumstances that influenced their choices, and the consequences their decisions had produced for others. This comprehensive awareness allowed for judgments that took into account moral complexity rather than reducing evaluation to simple tallies of good and bad deeds. The weighing of souls represented the most dramatic aspect of the judgment process, utilizing supernatural instruments capable of measuring the true moral weight of an individual's life choices. These scales responded not to physical mass but to spiritual essence, detecting and quantifying qualities like compassion, justice, courage, and wisdom, while also measuring negative attributes including cruelty, selfishness, cowardice, and willful ignorance. The balance between positive and negative qualities determined each soul's appropriate placement within the underworld's various regions. The criteria used for judgment reflected sophisticated understanding of moral complexity that recognized the influence of circumstances, opportunities, and limitations that affected human behavior during life. Souls born into privilege and security were held to higher standards than those who had struggled with poverty or oppression, recognizing that moral behavior required not only good intentions but also the practical ability to act on them. Similarly, judges considered whether individuals had received proper moral education during life or had been raised in environments that promoted ethical behavior, adjusting their evaluations to account for these formative influences. The judicial system also addressed questions of cultural relativity, recognizing that moral standards varied across different societies and historical periods. The judges received extensive training in comparative ethics and cultural practices, enabling them to evaluate souls according to the moral frameworks that had governed their societies rather than imposing uniform standards that might be inappropriate or unfair. This approach required careful balancing between cultural sensitivity and universal moral principles that transcended specific societies, a philosophical challenge that generated ongoing discussion among the judges and their advisors. Divine intervention occasionally complicated the judgment process when gods chose to advocate for particular souls, or when cosmic considerations required modification of standard procedures. The judges were obligated to consider divine requests while maintaining their independence and commitment to fundamental principles of justice, creating situations that required diplomatic skill and philosophical sophistication to resolve satisfactorily. These exceptional cases established precedents that influenced future judgments while demonstrating that even divine beings respected the judicial system's authority within its proper domain. Appeals processes allowed souls to request reconsideration of their initial judgments if they believed errors had been made, or if new evidence emerged that might affect their cases. These appeals were handled by specialized panels that included representatives from all three judicial courts, ensuring that multiple perspectives were considered in reviewing controversial decisions. The appeals system was designed to correct genuine errors while preventing frivolous challenges that might undermine the judicial system's authority and efficiency. The transition from the mythological underworld of Greek antiquity to its Roman reinterpretation involved more than simple renaming of gods and places, encompassing fundamental shifts in theological emphasis and cultural values that transformed the realm of the dead into something that served different religious and social functions. Roman civilization's pragmatic approach to religion and its emphasis on legal structures and administrative efficiency influenced how the underworld was conceived, organized, and integrated into broader religious practice. The Roman underworld maintained the essential geography and major figures of its Greek predecessor, while adapting them to serve the needs of an expanding empire with increasingly diverse populations and complex social hierarchies. The Roman identification of Hades with Pluto emphasized the god's role as dispenser of underground wealth rather than focusing primarily on his function as judge of the dead. This shift reflected Roman cultural values that celebrated material prosperity and recognized the empire's dependence on mineral resources including gold, silver, copper, and iron extracted from mines throughout conquered territories. Pluto's favor became associated with successful mining operations, discovery of rich or deposits, and the overall economic prosperity that these resources provided, creating a more positive image for the ruler of the underworld than Greek tradition had generally maintained. Proserpina, the Roman equivalent of Persephone, underwent similar transformation with increased emphasis on her agricultural functions and decreased attention to the traumatic aspects of her original abduction story. Roman religious practice focused on practical benefits that divine favor could provide, making Proserpina's role in seasonal cycles and crop fertility more relevant than psychological exploration of her experiences as an unwilling bride. This pragmatic approach characterized Roman adaptation of Greek mythology generally, retaining useful elements while modifying or eliminating aspects that seemed less relevant to contemporary Roman concerns. The Roman pantheon integrated underworld deities into a comprehensive religious system that emphasized reciprocal relationships between humans and gods. Romans understood religious practice as essentially contractual, with proper rituals and offerings compelling divine beings to provide specific benefits in return. This transactional approach influenced how the underworld was conceived and how its rulers were approached through religious observance. The cult of Pluto and Proserpina developed elaborate ritual cycles coordinated with agricultural seasons and mining operations, creating year-round opportunities for worshippers to maintain relationships with these powerful deities. Roman legal concepts influenced how underworld justice was understood and portrayed in literature and popular culture. The Roman emphasis on written law, formal procedure, and systematic jurisprudence created frameworks for understanding divine justice as operating according to recognizable legal principles rather than arbitrary divine whim. Roman authors described underworld courts that functioned much like terrestrial legal systems, with formal charges, presentation of evidence, and opportunities for defense that mirrored earthly judicial procedures. This legalistic approach made the underworld seem more comprehensible and potentially navigable through proper preparation and moral behavior during life. The development of Roman mystery religions drew heavily on Greek precedents while adapting them to Roman social structures and religious needs. The cult of Mithras, which became particularly popular among Roman soldiers, incorporated underworld imagery and concepts of posthumous judgment while emphasizing themes of military valor, personal discipline, and loyalty to both divine and earthly authority. Mithraic initiation ceremonies included symbolic journeys through underworld regions that tested candidates' courage and commitment while promising favorable treatment after death for those who proved worthy during mortal life. The persistence of Eleusinian mysteries under Roman rule demonstrated the continuing appeal of Greek religious traditions that offered detailed preparation for death and promises of blessed afterlife for properly initiated individuals. Roman authorities generally tolerated these Greek mystery cults provided they did not threaten political stability or challenge imperial religious policies. The mysteries continued to attract participants from throughout the empire, including Romans seeking spiritual experiences that complemented rather than replaced their traditional religious practices. Imperial cult practices incorporated underworld concepts through the deification of deceased emperors who were understood to have joined the ranks of divine beings with influence over posthumous existence. This development created new categories of divine authority that bridged the gap between mortal achievement and divine power, suggesting that exceptional individuals could influence underworld operations through their posthumous divine status. The apotheosis of emperors involved elaborate ceremonies that symbolically guided the deceased ruler's soul through underworld regions to its final divine destination, creating public spectacles that reinforced imperial authority while demonstrating Rome's power over life, death, and eternity. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire created unprecedented challenges for traditional underworld concepts as Christian theology offered radically different approaches to death, judgment, and eternal existence. Early Christian thinkers faced the complex task of articulating their distinctive beliefs about the afterlife while addressing audiences familiar with Greek and Roman underworld traditions. This theological challenge led to sophisticated synthesis that incorporated familiar imagery while transforming its underlying meaning and spiritual significance. Christian concepts of hell drew selectively on Greek underworld geography and punishment traditions while introducing new theological principles that fundamentally altered their significance. The Christian hell was understood as eternal punishment for moral and spiritual failure, rather than a neutral destination for all souls, creating sharper distinctions between salvation and damnation than existed in earlier traditions. However, Christian descriptions of hell incorporated familiar elements including rivers of fire, regions of darkness, and specialized punishments that resonated with audiences familiar with Tartarus and its torments. The development of purgatory as an intermediate state between earthly death and final judgment represented Christian theological innovation that drew upon earlier concepts of posthumous purification found in Orphic and other mystery traditions. Purgatory provided a framework for understanding how souls could undergo moral improvement after death, addressing theological problems about divine justice and mercy that had challenged earlier Christian thinkers. The concept's development involved careful integration of biblical authority with philosophical reasoning that drew upon classical precedents while maintaining distinctively Christian theological commitments. Medieval European culture grappled with the legacy of classical mythology while attempting to maintain Christian orthodoxy, creating complex relationships between pagan literary traditions and contemporary religious beliefs. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy represented the most influential medieval synthesis of classical underworld traditions with Christian theology, creating a comprehensive vision of posthumous existence that incorporated elements from multiple sources while maintaining theological coherence. Dante's Inferno drew extensively on classical descriptions of underworld geography, punishment traditions, and mythological figures while adapting them to support Christian teaching about sin and redemption. The persistence of classical mythological imagery throughout medieval and Renaissance art demonstrated the enduring cultural power of these ancient traditions despite official Christian dismissal of pagan religious beliefs. Artists found in classical mythology rich sources of imagery and narrative that could be reinterpreted to serve Christian purposes, while maintaining connections to prestigious ancient cultural achievements. The figure of Charon, for example, appeared frequently in Renaissance depictions of the Last Judgment. His role as ferryman adapted to serve Christian eschatology while maintaining his visual identity from classical sources. The Enlightenment period brought systematic critical analysis to traditional underworld concepts while creating new frameworks for understanding death and its relationship to human meaning and social organization. Enlightenment philosophers subjected traditional religious claims about the afterlife to rigorous rational analysis, often finding them lacking in empirical support or logical coherence. However, these same philosophers recognized the cultural and psychological significance of underworld traditions and sought to understand their continuing influence on human behavior and social organization. Modern psychological interpretation of underworld mythology began with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who developed frameworks for understanding ancient narratives as expressions of universal psychological patterns rather than literal descriptions of supernatural realities. Jungian analysis identified archetypal patterns in underworld mythology that reflected fundamental aspects of human psychological development, particularly processes of confronting mortality and integrating unconscious material into conscious awareness. This psychological approach to mythology created therapeutic applications that used ancient narratives as frameworks for understanding contemporary psychological and social problems. The legacy of the Greek underworld extends far beyond academic study of ancient religion to encompass fundamental aspects of how Western civilization understands justice, moral responsibility, and the relationship between individual choices and ultimate meaning. The concepts of posthumous judgment, moral accountability, and the possibility of transcending mortality through spiritual development that emerged from ancient Greek underworld traditions continue to influence legal systems, educational approaches, and personal ethical frameworks throughout the Western world and beyond. Contemporary fascination with the underworld persists across multiple cultural domains, including literature, film, video games, and popular philosophy. Modern retellings of classical myths continue to find audiences who recognize in these ancient stories frameworks for exploring universal human concerns about death, justice, and the meaning of existence. The underworld's geography and inhabitants provide rich symbolic language for discussing psychological states, social conditions, and philosophical questions that remain relevant despite vast changes in material circumstances and technological capabilities. The enduring significance of the Greek underworld reflects its success in addressing fundamental human needs for understanding death and its implications. The sophisticated theological, philosophical, and artistic achievements of ancient Greek underworld traditions continue to enrich Western culture while providing resources for addressing the universal human challenges of mortality, moral development, and the search for transcendent meaning. The realm of Hades, conceived in the Archaic period and elaborated through centuries of Greek and Roman cultural development, remains a powerful testament to humanity's endless fascination with what lies beyond the boundary of life, and the possibility that death might not be the end but rather a transformation into something we can barely imagine but cannot help attempting to understand.